My name is Patrick J. McGinnis, and I coined the term FOMO. That's short for fear of missing out, and it's why some people end up following the crowd. But we're not like them. We're part of a new species that isn't afraid to do things differently. I call us FOMO Sapiens. And this is the show where you'll meet people like us, phenomenal FOMO Sapiens, to learn how they find the courage and the ideas to live exceptional lives. FOMO. FOMO. Welcome to another episode of FOMO Sapiens, the show for people who don't just follow the crowd, but instead take their own path to success in business and in life. I'm your host, Patrick J. McGinnis, venture capitalist by day, author and podcaster by night, and as you well know, FOMO Sapiens 24/7. Now, today I am joined by, I think, somebody who is more of a FOMO Sapiens than me, potentially. She has the FOMO. She does a million things very successfully. It all comes together in a very elegant way. But explaining it, well, it takes a little time. And so that's what we're going to do on the show today. Now, my guest is Melinda Arons. We're going to be talking about how to use media to change minds. Now, Melinda is the founder of Arons Advisors, a boutique consulting firm at the intersection of media and social change. She is the former senior vice president of social impact at Participant Media, where she oversaw campaigns aligned with the company's films, including RBG, Roma, Judas, and The Black Messiah, Just Mercy, and many others. Now, she started her career at Fox News and then spent 12 years at ABC News as a producer for Good Morning America and Nightline, and ultimately became the chief political producer and senior producer. She has also had senior roles at Facebook and the Hillary for America presidential campaign. Now, the reason why I invited Melinda, though, that's all very good, was because she was part of the team that produced the January 6th hearings. I kept hearing about this senior person from ABC who was making all those video montages and all that stuff for the J6 hearings, which I watched some of them. And then I discovered it was her one day, and it kind of blew my mind. So being able to talk to somebody who has crafted a narrative, a convincing narrative, well, depending on what you believe, but taking this crazy amount of information and distilling it down into a message. To me, that is fascinating. And listen, this is a political episode. Melinda is very involved in politics. So we do talk about politics, but I'm not trying to be partisan here. What I want to do is just understand how somebody uses media to tell a story and change minds. And that is exactly the business that Melinda's always been in. So she's a really fascinating guest. And what's great is you will hear next Monday on FOMO Mondays. We did a little bit of FOMO therapy. So I saved that up for Monday because, you know, we get into FOMO. We get into it deep. And Melinda is a great person to talk about what drives her FOMO and how she deals with it. Now, this week, my little small ask is very basic. Talking about communications and media, go check out the FOMA campaign, Mercado Ads, part of Mercado Libre. I am very thankful to be the face of that campaign. We have invented this word FOMA, fear of missing audience, together and launched it into the world. You can find that commercial on my LinkedIn, on my Instagram at Patrick J. McGinnis. The LinkedIn, by the way, is Patrick-McGinnis. You can find it on Mercado Ads site, ads.mercadolibre.com.ar. All over the place. Go check it out. I would love your feedback and thoughts. All right, and now onto the episode. As you know, I start every episode with the same question. So I started by asking Melinda this. What's a formative decision you've had to make to get to where you are today?
I don't know if I'm just saying this because we know each other from college, but I think going to Georgetown was a pretty formative decision, both from a positive and negative perspective, mainly positive. But, you know, when I think about every job I've ever had, you know, technically it could probably be traced back to the network I formed at Georgetown. And then certainly from a friendship, you know, network perspective, which, you know, I'm very reliant and grateful for my friend group. And while friends from college are probably, you know, they're not the only major friendship network I have, they're a significant one. So, yeah.
If you consider being on FOMO Sapiens one of your jobs,
yeah,
that fits.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to have you on, we've been talking about this for a while, but you're one of these people who you're a complete FOMO Sapiens. You have a really unique path. There's a through line. So it's not random per se, but you've done a lot of different things. Yeah. And we'll get into some of that stuff. But like, just to get started, like, just describe, like, how would you describe yourself?
Professionally or overall?
We'll start with professional, but you can throw in some personal stuff.
I mean, I just heard somebody introduce themselves at a cocktail party as a hybrid. So I've decided I'm a hybrid. I guess I would say, I'm a consultant. And so I consult on media strategy, and that sort of spans multiple different areas. A lot of sort of strategic communications, political strategic comms. But I like to think of myself as sort of an expert on like narrative change, and then everything sort of falls under that. So there's either strategic communications that you need to have a narrative shift in a political debate, on an issue, on an idea that is in service of social change. Like, okay, well, if we're going to combat climate change, we have to shift how we think about this, and then that's like kind of something I work on with a couple of clients. And then, I still do some producing, which I guess we'll get into later, but that was my background was, for 12 years, I was at ABC News and I was chief political producer at Nightline and covered like every kind of story. And so I feel like I'm not really explaining myself well.
This is what happens to the FOMO Sapiens, but you
tough.
did say, because you said narrative change.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
I guess my overarching thing would be when you say like, I've done a lot of random things, but there's a through line. I do think that's true. And I think the through line in retrospect, when I piece everything together, is leveraging different forms of media to further positive social change. And sometimes that is on an issue. Sometimes that's political. And, sometimes it's through film, and television, but it's all different forms of media in service of, ideally like trying to make the world a better place.
To change people's minds. Yeah. And you, this is like this was a moment that I was like, I was just kind of blew my mind I like Instagram. So I'm scrolling Instagram and I follow you, and I had heard for the January 6th committee hearings, I had read in the press somewhere that all the film montages that were very affecting and well done, and I watched a bunch of those hearings. I had heard that they were produced by a former TV news producer. And I just remember being like, whoever did that did a great job, and America should say thank you. And maybe some folks that are listening didn't watch, but like they were very well done and moving and effective. And one day I'm scrolling through Instagram and I'm like, it turns out you were the person who did this. And so it blew my mind. Like literally my head fell off of my shoulders. I had to put it back on. But so let's talk about that. Let's start there, because that is kind of like that's going to be in, not to be morbid, but it's going to be in the obit. It might be the lead on the obit, which is going to be a long time for now. But talk about how that happened.
Yeah. So, my former boss at ABC News is a guy named James Goldston. Mm-hmm. He started at ABC. Gosh, I mean, he was my boss when I was like 27 or something. Mm-hmm. So long time ago. Mm-hmm. I won't say how long, but pretty long. And then he ultimately became president of ABC News, and he and I were always close collaborators. And, I worked for him for many, many years. He was my boss for many years at ABC. I then left ABC a decade ago. He left a little less than 2 years ago. And he and I had always stayed in touch. We were still in touch, talking about some projects together in the sort of docuseries space. And then it was literally exactly a year ago. It was just a couple weeks before Memorial Day. I get this call from him. He's like, I'm at Union Station. I just came out of the most surreal meeting of my life. I was in Liz Cheney's office for 2 hours. They want me to produce the January 6th committee hearings. Do you want to do it? And I was like, one, yes, that sounds incredible. And two, like, what does that mean? And he was like, we have no idea. Just like, when can you be here? So it started with myself, James, and an incredible colleague named Mary Marsh. I hope she doesn't mind me mentioning her by name, who is also former ABC News and lives in DC. And then there were other producers, two others. One I'm also going to name, I hope he doesn't mind, named Steve Baker, also incredible former Nightline.
If you're going to sue somebody, Steve and Mary, you can sue Melinda, not Patrick. And so ultimately it ended up being this sort of like weird little team of like former producer Avengers who, were called by our leader to come to DC and do this. And, at the time it was completely
secret. And, we weren't able to tell anybody. And I could talk forever about how it all came together, but that was how it happened. And, it was a really out of nowhere left field thing. I mean, nobody had ever done it before or since, had sort of, former news producers creating, hearings to be broadcast live in prime time. And I'm very, very glad that they called James, and I'm super glad he called me, because it was, it was the hardest thing I've ever done by a mile, but it was also like by far the most gratifying and rewarding thing I've ever done.
So when you think about the challenge there, I don't have to tell you, you're trying to establish truth in a quote, I hate this term, a post-truth world, whatever. You have a lot, people who clearly, you can look at the footage, and we've seen this in our politics. Like some people are like, that person's a freedom fighter, other person's like, that person's a criminal, blah, 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 blah. So what did you learn? It's like, that's such a responsibility. What did you learn in that process? I
learned so much. Gosh, that's a very hard question to answer, because I also learned a lot personally, about the way I work and high pressure situations. FOMO. I guess I would say from a national political perspective, I think something we have to remember is for better or worse, obviously, I guess I would say for worse, but you kind of can't get away from it. We are in a place in our politics where it is really about 10,000 people in 6 states. And we saw this in the midterms. Obviously, abortion was a huge driving issue, but I would like to think that the hearings did an incredibly effective job of communicating to independents, the people who you can convince and need to be convinced that this person is a huge threat to democracy. We were talking about narrative change and how do you shift people's hearts and minds, even when it's incredibly difficult to do. And I was listening to the Daily podcast on the New York Times podcast right after the last hearing. And I think it was Luke Broadwater, who's the congressional correspondent for the Times, who was sitting in on all of the hearings every day, was the interview. And he was saying how when these hearings began, most Americans thought of January 6th as an isolated day of violence. And that what the hearings did was shift that narrative to people understanding it was several months of plotting and planning at the highest levels of government, really led by the president. And, I haven't seen a poll to back that up, but if that's true, it's like, our work here is done, because that was the shift that needed to happen. And so I think what's really, really difficult and challenging, and again, I suffer from this too, is when you see this sort of post-truth world, you see the completely, siloed media ecosystems that people are getting their information from, that's just getting worse and worse. You have to remember that there are thousands of people out there that are not following these things at the level we are, and you can make a difference. It does make a difference, and that those are the people that need convincing. I do not think that there is a world in which the most diehard Trump supporter watches the hearings and comes away with a wildly new perspective. I would love that, but that might not be the case. What is really important is getting, those folks in the middle, and they are there, and they do need to be I don't want to say radicalized, but, there is a democracy voter that is emerging right now as a result of the last few years. And those people need to be spoken to. And so to the degree that the hearings did that, I feel very good about that. And then, history will judge whether, who knows if he'll get charged. We don't know what's going to happen, but, and then I would just like to say one other thing, which is it ended up being that they were so effective and well-received, and that was just incredible and so gratifying. But at the beginning, when a lot of people were poo-pooing them, David Brooks wrote this column the day they started.
Yeah, he hated on that.
We printed that column out and put it on the wall, and we were like,
dartboard.
Really? It was it was one of our many inspirations. But, even when people were sort of saying this is not going to make a difference in the beginning, it almost doesn't matter. Like, you cannot have an attack on the U.S. Capitol and not have a congressional investigation. Like, we don't have a country if you don't do that. Like, it's like saying, well, you're sorry, we're the police and your child is dead, but we're not going to investigate it. We're not going to tell you what we find because it's not going to bring your kid back. It's like, what? No, you have to, you have to investigate these things. You have to. So even if it's just for the historical record to look back 50, 100 years from now, it was worth doing. It happens to be that the investigators were incredible and they got the goods, and that hopefully we were able to help share those goods with the public in a meaningful way.
It reminds me what you say. I mean, it's interesting. The point about the fact that the story that was told, it wasn't just today, but there was a lot leading up to. You're right, because I think even though I was following the whole thing, I was like, okay, now I get the through line on that. And then and it's funny, I had this conversation the other day. Like, it seems like generative AI, our favorite topic here on FOMO Sapiens, just came out of nowhere. Yeah. But if you think about it, this has been going on for years. There's so many things that pop up. But there's like anything else in life. It's like when the by the time you realize it's happening, it's probably already been happening for a long time. Now, you're in the business of getting people to wake up, and so you worked at participant media, where the same kind of skills you drew on in your work in January 6 hearings, you use for using media. And what I want to get into that is, for those who are listening, we have a lot of people on this that listen to the show who are entrepreneurs, or they're building things, or they're trying to convince people to change behavior. And that's like the hardest thing to do, is get people to change the way they do things. And that's kind of the business you're in. So talk about, what the work of Participant was, and sort of what you were trying to do there.
Yeah. Participant was founded by Jeff Skoll, who was the first president of eBay. And when eBay was sold and he became a billionaire, he became a major philanthropist. He has the Skoll Foundation, which is an incredible, more traditional grant-making foundation. He has an impact investment firm, and then he started Participant. And the first film, so Participant is a film studio that funds and distributes films and TV. And their first film was Inconvenient Truth. And then there was a whole series of films. I joke, I started there in 2017, and it was the year they had Roma, RBG, and there were multiple Oscar nominees and ultimately winners that year. And I like to joke that, it was the year I joined. But no, they do, it's the whole model of the company is, we're not just going to fund these films and help develop them. We are also going to put money aside to run social impact campaigns that are aligned with the content. So that was my role. So I just want to be totally clear, because I don't ever want to take...
You were not in the film, Roma.
I don't ever want to take credit, for something I had nothing to do with. And so the actual development of those films, I was sort of adjacent to, but not, on that team. I was on the impact team. And so I oversaw the impact campaigns, and happy to talk about, like, what the hell is a film impact campaign? Should I explain what that is? Because a lot of people don't know what it is.
Yeah, I think you should.
Yeah. So essentially, again, back to sort of leveraging all different forms of media. When a film comes out, there's a lot that goes into it, right? There's, ideally, if you're lucky, a huge marketing campaign. There's a lot of awareness. So when you see a billboard on Sunset, or you see ads on the subway, or on, TV or whatever, that's all part of a huge marketing campaign, getting people excited to see the film. And so the idea is basically, how do you leverage, the kind of unique nature of a film to change hearts and minds? And what that ends up meaning is, you usually work really closely with the filmmakers, any kind of studio partners, marketing folks on the studio side, to figure out sort of, who holds, my boss used to say, who holds the why? Why did I want to make this movie? What do I want to see come out of it? If you're making a movie with Participant, like, you have a why, right? You're not making some
right. These are films with
sequel.
a purpose.
Yeah, these are films with a purpose. Yeah. So you sort of figure out what's, what the why is, and then our part is it's really strategic partnerships. It's like, who are the right organizations who will take this film and just embrace it, and that can take multiple forms. So it can be plugging into a political campaign, trying to get a piece of legislation passed. It can be much more broad, again, from like a narrative perspective. So, for example, with Roma, it was the first ever film that had a lead character who was an indigenous Mexican woman who was a domestic worker. So that was a really unique opportunity. It has, the challenge of having been a narrative feature film, but that was a really huge moment. It had a huge, it won all of these Oscars. Alfonso Cuarón, the director, was incredibly into the idea of doing social impact around it. And very long story short, partnered with IGENPU and the National Domestic Workers Alliance to try and push forward various initiatives. Some of that was at a very high level, like just getting people to see domestic workers differently. And then some was very specific, like how do we plug this campaign into getting a National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights? And so again, it can take all different kinds of forms, but it is really, really interesting. And films are so unique. I mean, there are not a lot of mediums where you watch something and you leave and you're like a changed person. And, movies can do that. And so the idea is if you have a film that people are going to see and they're going to be activated to do something, like what's the something you're asking them to do? And how do you make sure that you've got partners on the front lines of that issue who are ready to embrace the film and take it out to their audiences? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's Roma's a film that I watched. It took me, I had stopped it like 5 times because it's like cheese. You can only have a little bit at a time. But then, so I was like, it's kind of a little bit like, am I bored here? But then I cried at the end. So clearly it got to me. FOMO. Now, what I'm hearing though, as we think about kind of what the big picture takeaway here, what I want to focus on with you is, you're in the business of getting people to change their thinking and getting people to care about something, whether it's the person watching in the movie theater or it's the reporter at the New York Times. And that is like, attention is such a treasure these days because I have no attention, right? So talk about like how one does that.
Oh God, that is so tough. Honestly, I think it's a great question. I think from a media perspective, I'm very intentional with clients. I really only want to take on projects where I, as a journalist, would want to be educated on this topic and would want to write the story or tell the story. I try to do that. Sometimes I fall down, but generally speaking, I don't consider myself a sort of typical media relations person, and that I really only want to pitch something that I would want to do myself as a journalist. So I try and sort of look at it from that perspective and working backwards. So how do you get somebody to care? I mean, that is a very tough question. It's sort of like, when you see it, but I think that there's a mixture of both. There are certain things that are just great stories that haven't been told. I mean, there's so many great stories that haven't been told. That's why we have Hollywood. That's why we have media. People are hungry for storytelling. So sometimes you just hear a story that's like, wow, that's an incredible project. I think the thing that I don't know if was my training or it's just something like organic, but James Goldston, who is the same guy who, brought me in on the hearings and, is an unbelievable storyteller and all kinds of medium. He once said, as an executive producer, when he was my boss at Nightline, he would get very frustrated when producers would come in all hot and bothered and say, we've got to cover this, we've got to cover child soldiers in the Congo, just a topic. And he would say, that's a topic, that's not a story. And so when you're at that level at an ABC News or a New York Times or, these media organizations, one of the best parts of your training is just knowing inherently what's a topic versus what's a story. And I think one of the big challenges with how do you know a good story or how do you convince people of something, how do you get people to care, it's really just like, wow, there's this amazing character that can help open up the world of this story and helping people identify what that is. And then, obviously you have to be connected to the right people who are going to care about what you want them to care about. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes you throw stuff out or it takes a really long time. But that's sort of a very vague way of putting it. I'm not being specific.
I don't think that's vague at all,
sense?
Actually, because anybody who's listening to this, who say you have a new toothbrush, okay? like you're doing the Quip competitor, which I don't recommend you doing, right? It's just like, we didn't even need Quip. But anyway, it's like you're trying to market that. You're trying to, and I have a podcast. How many publicists reach out to me a week with their pitch? And they're not that these people aren't good at their jobs or whatever, but like there's so much volume out there. And it's like the ones that get the breakthrough, they're so thoughtful. And so if you have, you're right, like it's National blank awareness month, like, yay, that doesn't do anything for me. If you bring me a person, a character, somebody who moves my heart, I will cover the person, I will cover the story, I won't cover the topic. So I actually think that's a super valuable insight that I don't think a lot of people talk about.
Yeah. And it is really fascinating that a lot of people don't get that. It's like, well, why aren't they covering this? And it's like, because they have a job to do that's really hard. And they have metrics, which is the number of people watching their show or reading their piece. And, it's like people in the media are not there for their health. They're there to tell great stories. So if you want them to tell a great story, you got to help them find the great story. They're not just going to cover it because you asked them to. And they shouldn't, And I think, going back to the hearings, look, part of that was just, as I said, we take no credit whatsoever for what the incredible investigators and congressional staff did. These investigators are just, there should be a show about them. These guys came from, and men and women who came from all over, private sector, former AUSAs, district attorneys, lawyers at firms. Many of them left their families, to do something that they thought was going to be 3 or 4 months. It ended up being a full year, working around the clock. And, so what I'm trying to get at is when I say they got the goods from an investigative, legal perspective, but they also got the goods from a storytelling perspective. And these characters that emerged that we never could have imagined would have emerged in the way that they did. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is even back to the hearings, it really was about those characters. Some of them were crazy. Some of them were just so unbelievably patriotic and compelling, like the women in Georgia, the election workers, Shay and Ruby, who, Giuliani went after, Trump went after. They were chased from their homes. It just, do you remember this, the part of the story in the state pressure? It's actually coming up again now with these Georgia
and you tell it
story.
Like a story. That's the thing about it. It's not just facts, it's a story.
Yeah, it's human beings. And it's the human story of what Trump and his people did.
Melinda, it's been really interesting. I really appreciate your insights on kind of getting people, I guess, changing hearts and minds and how to tell those stories. And this is applicable to everything, folks. So think about what we talked about today and, use it in your work. If you want to find out more about Melinda is not, it's interesting for such a FOMO sapien. She's pretty low key on the socials, but you can find her on LinkedIn. And if you want to work with her, maybe you have a project that makes sense. The name of her organization is the Arons Group, Arons.
Actually, Arons Advisors.
Arons Advisors.
Yeah.
See, I'm terrible. I am clearly not good at changing hearts and minds. Arons Advisors. So go check that out. All right, Melinda Arons, founder of Arons Advisors and, FOMO Sapiens. Thanks for being here. FOMO. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at Patrick J. McGinnis, on Twitter at PJ McGinnis, and on the web at FOMOSapiens.com or PatrickMcGinnis.com, where you can get all kinds of free resources to live a more decisive and entrepreneurial life. FOMO Sapiens is recorded in New York City. Theme music is by Mike McGinnis, and editing and post-production is by Josh Elstro. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me at FOMOSapiens.com and at PatrickMcGinnis.com. To advertise on FOMO Sapiens, reach out to contact@FOMOSapiens.com. FOMO.